psychology and education. We know that certain events can have negative impacts on people, and those people include children. And we know some of those events are called divorce, separation, mental illness in the family, a death in the family, physical handicaps, accidents, repeated moving locations where the family is living, homelessness, hunger. There's probably
Weddings are
weddings,
one too, actually.
decrease,
Because the stress level
Right.
that they have from their parents is actually one too.
right, recombining families, decrease in income, or rise in income. All of those kind of rejigger how things happen and what we do. So the question always is, well, what are we going to do about that? Should we just stop the events? Good luck with that one, right? Again, research comes and says that it's not necessarily the event itself, it's how the person, and in this case, the student or the child, experiences that event. So the impact can be negative without the support needed, or the impact can build resilient skills for the future with support. So with that introduction, aren't you all eager to hear all the different supports and programs and amazing things that Bosco School District is in place and offers to our students? So, yes, we did.
Very impressive.
Well, we figured we'll start out, and I'm going to let Kim start first, of just kind of telling about our history, so where we're coming from when we're talking to you. So, Kim.
Well, I'm Kim Nikolajczyk. I'm the principal of the newest school in Moscow, who just turned 50. We had a nice celebration. Was that last week? It seems so long ago. But and I have been at McDonald Elementary for 14 years. These last 4 years have been the principal. I've been the principal there. Prior to that, I was the school counselor at McDonald for 10 years, working with lots of kids that we're going to talk about today. Prior to my employment at Moscow School District, I worked for the state of Idaho Department of Health and Welfare and Child Protection, doing investigations of child abuse and neglect, working with families to help keep their children safe, as well as in children's mental health, mostly in therapeutic foster homes, of helping keep children in a family environment rather than them going into residential treatments, and working with those foster families to support them. So I've had a long history of trauma abuse professionally, and I can remember starting off in this field and saying, how can I relate? And I remember my mentor saying, and I was not a parent at that time, and I'm like, how do I work with parents and say, you need to be a better parent? I'm not even a parent. And she says, but you have been a child. Have you felt protected, loved, secure in a home? You know, and so that helped me a lot. And so I work with lots of families now that are experiencing all sorts of stressors and trauma. And just because someone experiences a trauma doesn't mean it's the end for them. It depends on what the supports are there for them and their resiliency.
Greg Bailey, graduated of Moscow High, class of 1980. We went out with the bangs, Mount St. Helens.
You've got early release.
Early release. Awesome. Yeah. I taught 6 years in Carson City, Nevada. I was in the middle school and teaching, I was a special education teacher, and was teaching, had a whole classroom of 17 kids that all had some levels of mental health issues. So it was, I learned how to work with kids with situations and stress levels and things like that pretty quickly, or else I wasn't going to survive. After 6 years of doing that, I worked and got my master's degree and ended up coming back to Idaho. I ended up stopping at Grangeville for 22 years and working there as I was a half-time assistant principal of a K-8 school with, at that time, 720 kids, and half-time special ed director for the Grangeville School District, which, if you know, is the size of Connecticut with one stoplight. So a lot of distance between each school. I worked myself. I went into a principal position when I took over the K through 8 school. They dropped down to 650 kids, so they decided I didn't need a vice principal, and actually I only had a counselor 1 day a week.
Oh.
So luckily it was Jerry Lilly, that I think a lot of you guys know. So that was nice, but I learned I had to deal with kids and stressed out kids. I spent a lot of time as principal sitting in a timeout room with kids. Actually enjoyed it because it was a quiet time for me. They'd always say, well, I'm putting you in timeout. I'm going, yes. After that, they moved me to the district office where I was a curriculum director, HR, and federal programs director for quite a few years, and then they had me move into the superintendency there for 5 years, and then I had the opportunity to come to Moscow, and I've been here for 5 years. I'm working on my 6th year. So, and we're here, and we're going to talk about, we really kind of want to wrap around exactly all the things that we do with kids, with prevention to crisis situations and so forth, and try to kind of give you an overview of how we see our jobs working with kids, because we're trying to change the tone of students with mental health issues, with students that just are having some type of trauma, to realize that it is part of our job to deal with the whole child. So, I'll start out, and there we go. I'm going to start. You go ahead and start.
And so Diane just gave this definition. And like we said before, the experiences can come from economic hardship, various forms of abuse, even neighborhood violence, divorces, change in family styles, and incarcerations of parents. I thought it was interesting when I read this quote about the neighborhood violence, and it made me think of a young boy that I had met with that was having a hard time in class, and when I started talking to him, he recounted a situation where he lived, his family lived in an apartment complex, and he heard yelling outside of his apartment. So of course, what does a 7-year-old do? Goes out and looks to see what was happening. And there were 2 people fighting, like physically fighting. And the apartment complex had outdoor stairs, to go to the 2nd floor. So he hid behind the stairs, and this fight ensued right in front of him and the stairs, and he was hiding behind the stairs with the slats and watched the whole thing. And that's what made me think of that with that neighbor. I mean, he was secure in his own home, but just living in that environment impacted him. Do I need just take this? I pulled some data, and this is what's interesting, is what we're finding is the more traumatic events, the more it impacts kids, surprise, surprise, right? And so here's some data from across the nation, and this is birth to age 17, the percentage of students reported to have adverse childhood experiences. So across the nation, we see that 54% of kids said, I haven't had anything, 35% 1 or 2, and 3 or more is 11%. In our state, we can see the numbers aren't as great. Only 50% had 0, 35, 1 or 2, 15%. And then I pulled our neighboring state that you can see those numbers. They said Oklahoma had the worst data, where you see 17% of kids in Oklahoma had 3 or more, and Connecticut had the best data, so I chose those two as well. Anybody leave me in
Yeah, that's what
This is the percentage of students with one or more academic concerns by that ACE exposure. So they looked at how are they doing academically in school, dependent on how many exposures to ACE. And so you see down at the bottom that there was 0 events up to 3 or more events. And of course, what do we see? More academic problems with the more traumatic events that occur. So now we don't only have a child that has trauma going on in their life, but they're also having a great deal of difficulty being successful academically at school.
These are, one thing that we do, and if people ask me what's my goal for the school is to make sure that kids have these 5 things. And these are things that I read that the parents want. And it was a real short book and everything, but when I looked at it, I was going, wow, this really, it's what I would want for my kids. And number 1 thing that they want for their child, what do you think it is? You think it's education?
Safety, you told us.
Yeah. Okay, you guys go have a cup of coffee while I tell you. Yeah, thank you. Safety. Safety is number 1. Number 2 is sense of belonging to the school. Number 3 is education. And some people say, well, no, education's your number 1. Tell me if you would put your child in a school that has the best educational program, but your kid is at risk of being harmed every day. You would. Number 4 is additional activities like extracurricular activities, things like that. And then the last thing that they want for their child is to, when they're done, to become good citizens. And that. So those 5 things in that order. So we have to look at, so we look at safety. We want them to have that sense of belonging, because if they have those, then they're ready for that educational part of it. So those are the things. So that is part of our jobs, not just teaching them the curriculum. So that's one thing we want to talk about.
Sure. And you can ask any student in my school, kindergarten up to 5th grade, I'm like, what's my number 1 job? And I'm like, to keep us safe. Usually they're in trouble. So it works.
Oh, I know.
That's great. As that last slide showed, not only the academic pieces are impacted, but obviously the social and behavioral impacts within the school with additional traumatic events. And I can give all sorts of examples, but if they don't know where they're going to go after school, or they don't know if their dad's going to get out of jail while they're in school, that's going to impact their behaviors. And then unfortunately, the behaviors that kids show in school does impact them socially. And the kids are like, yeah, I know, if I yell at the teacher, my friends won't know if I'll yell at them or not. So even as, very young, 5 and 6-year-olds, they get that when they're in a good state to get it, when they're able to acknowledge that. The other piece of this is the Moscow School District is really entrenched in mastery-based learning, that it's not so much a numbers game anymore of what assignments do I need to do in order to get an A. It's we meet the kids where they're at and push them to the standards where we want them to go for that year. And that holds true to this whole child as well, because we meet them where they're at. And if they're at a place where they can't form a sentence for that day because something happened overnight, then we're going to go there. We're not going to insist them on taking a 100-point test to show how well they know long division. And not to say that we're not going to teach them academics. We're going to meet them where they're at and push them to the direction they can be.
I would also add to that is just a couple things about the mastery base. One thing is what we're changing is, in a traditional school, our constants that we have is the time and the content. Variable is the learning. we're changing that around. We're making the learning the constant. The variables are the time and the instruction. So we're doing a lot more differentiated instruction, working with those. So those are some of the things we're working on. You know, it's one of those things too, is trying to look at percentages and trying to move away from that to a mastery level. And one of the reasons why is there's a couple examples we give. And one that I typically say is, okay, if you were on an airplane and ready to take off, and all of a sudden, you know, the captain says, hey, this is my first flight. You go, okay. I got a 90%. You're thinking, great, got an A, not a problem. I took 10 tests to get that average of an A.